Section 20 of Confessions, volumes 5 and 6. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Confessions, volumes 5 and 6, by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, anonymously translated. Section 20. Insensibly, I found myself desolate and alone in that house where I had formerly been the very soul, where, if I may so express myself, I had enjoyed a double life, and by degrees I accustomed myself to disregard everything that passed, and even those who dwelt there. To avoid continual mortifications, I shut myself up with my books, or else wept and sighed unnoticed in the woods. This life soon became insupportable. I felt that the presence of a woman so dear to me, while estranged from her heart, increased my unhappiness, and was persuaded that, ceasing to see her, I should feel myself less cruelly separated. I resolved, therefore, to quit the house, mentioned it to her, and she, far from opposing my resolution, approved it. She had an acquaintance at Grenoble called Madame de Deybens, whose husband was on terms of friendship with Monsieur Mably, chief provost of Lyons. Monsieur Deybens proposed my educating Monsieur Mably's children. I accepted this offer, and departed for Lyons without causing, and almost without feeling, the least regret at a separation, the bare idea of which, a few months before, would have given both of us the most excruciating torments. I had almost as much knowledge as was necessary for a tutor, and flattered myself that my method would be unexceptionable. But the year I passed at Monsieur Mably's was sufficient to undeceive me in that particular. The natural gentleness of my disposition seemed calculated for the employment, if hastiness had not been mingled with it. While things went favorably, and I saw the pains, which I did not spare, succeed, I was an angel, but a devil when they went contrary. If my pupils did not understand me, I was hasty, and when they showed any symptoms of an untoward disposition, I was so provoked that I could have killed them, which behavior was not likely to render them either good or wise. I had two under my care, and they were of very different tempers. Sainte Marie, who was between 8 and 9 years old, had a good person and quick apprehension, was giddy, lively, playful, and mischievous, but his mischief was ever good humored. The younger one, named Condillac, appeared stupid and fretful, was headstrong as a mule, and seemed incapable of instruction. It may be supposed that between both I did not want employment, yet with patience and temper I might have succeeded. But wanting both, I did nothing worth mentioning, and my pupils profited very little. I could only make use of 3 means, which are very weak, and often pernicious with children, namely, sentiment, reasoning, passion. I sometimes exerted myself so much with Sainte Marie that I could not refrain from tears, and wished to excite similar sensations in him, as if it was reasonable to suppose a child could be susceptible to such emotions. Sometimes I exhausted myself in reasoning, as if persuaded he could comprehend me, and as he frequently formed very subtle arguments, concluded he must be reasonable, because he bid fair to be so good a logician. The little Condillac was still more embarrassing, for he neither understood, answered, nor was concerned at anything. He was of an obstinacy beyond belief, and was never happier than when he had succeeded in putting me in a rage. Then, indeed, he was the philosopher, and I the child. I was conscious of all my faults, studied the tempers of my pupils, and became acquainted with them, but where was the use of seeing the evil without being able to apply a remedy? My penetration was unavailing, since it never prevented any mischief, and everything I undertook failed, because all I did to effect my designs was precisely what I ought not to have done. I was not more fortunate in what had only reference to myself than in what concerned my pupils. Madame d'Esbans, in recommending me to her friend Madame de Mably, had requested her to form my manners, and endeavor to give me an air of the world. She took some pains on this account, wishing to teach me how to do the honors of the house, but I was so awkward, bashful, and stupid, that she found it necessary to stop there. This, however, did not prevent me from falling in love with her, according to my usual custom. I even behaved in such a manner that she could not avoid observing it, but I never durst declare my passion, and as the lady never seemed in a humor to make advances, I soon became weary of my sighs and ogling, being convinced they answered no manner of purpose. I had quite lost my inclination for little thieveries while with Madame de Warrens. Indeed, as everything belonged to me, there was nothing to steal. Besides, the elevated notions I had imbibed ought to have rendered me in future above such meanness, and generally speaking, they certainly did so. But this rather proceeded from my having learned to conquer temptations than having succeeded in rooting out the propensity, and I should even now greatly dread stealing, as in my infancy, were I yet subject to the same inclinations. I had a proof of this at Monsieur Mably's, when, though surrounded by a number of little things that I could easily have pilfered, and which appeared no temptation, I took it into my head to covet some white Arbois wine, some glasses of which I had drunk at table and thought delicious. It happened to be rather thick, and as I fancied myself an excellent finer of wine, I mentioned my skill, and this was accordingly trusted to my care. But in attempting to mend, I spoiled it, though to the sight only, for it remained equally agreeable to the taste. Profiting by this opportunity, I furnished myself from time to time with a few bottles to drink in my own apartment. But unluckily I could never drink without eating. The difficulty lay, therefore, in procuring bread. It was impossible to make a reserve of this article. To have it brought by the footman was discovering myself, and insulting the master of the house. I could not bear to purchase it myself. How could a fine gentleman with a sword at his side enter a baker's shop to buy a small loaf of bread? It was utterly impossible. At length I recollected the thoughtless saying of a great princess, who, on being informed that the country people had no bread, replied, "Then let them eat pastry." Yet even this resource was attended with a difficulty. I sometimes went out alone for this very purpose, running over the whole city, and passing 30 pastrycooks' shops, without daring to enter any one of them. In the first place, it was necessary there should be only one person in the shop, and that person's physiognomy must be so encouraging as to give me confidence to pass the threshold. But when once the dear little cake was procured, and I shut up in my chamber with that and a bottle of wine, taken cautiously from the bottom of a cupboard, how much did I enjoy drinking my wine and reading a few pages of a novel! For when I have no company, I always wish to read while eating. It seems a substitute for society, and I dispatch alternately a page and a morsel. 'Tis indeed as if my book dined with me. I was neither dissolute nor sottish, never in my whole life having been intoxicated with liquor. My little thefts were not very indiscreet, yet they were discovered. The bottles betrayed me, and though no notice was taken of it, I had no longer the management of the cellar. In all this, M. Malby conducted himself with prudence and politeness, being really a very deserving man, who, under a manner as harsh as his employment, concealed a real gentleness of disposition and uncommon goodness of heart. He was judicious, equitable, and, what would not be expected from an officer of the Maréchaussée, very humane. Sensible of his indulgence, I became greatly attached to him, which made my stay at Lyons longer than it would otherwise have been; but at length, disgusted with an employment which I was not calculated for, and a situation of great confinement, consequently disagreeable to me, after a year's trial, during which time I spared no pains to fulfill my engagement, I determined to quit my pupils, being convinced I should never succeed in educating them properly. M. Malby saw this as clearly as myself, though I am inclined to think he would never have dismissed me, had I not spared him the trouble, which was an excess of condescension in this particular that I certainly cannot justify. What rendered my situation yet more insupportable was the comparison I was continually drawing between the life I now led and that which I had quitted. The remembrance of my dear Charmette, my garden, trees, fountain, and orchard, but above all the company of her who was born to give life and soul to every other enjoyment. On calling to mind our pleasures and innocent life, I was seized with such oppressions and heaviness of heart, as deprived me of the power of performing anything as it should be. 100 times was I tempted instantly to set off on foot to my dear Madame de Warrens, being persuaded that could I once more see her, I should be content to die that moment. In fine, I could no longer resist the tender emotions which recalled me back to her, whatever it might cost me. I accused myself of not having been sufficiently patient, complacent, and kind, concluding I might yet live happily with her on the terms of tender friendship, and by showing more for her than I had hitherto done. I formed the finest projects in the world, burned to execute them, left all, renounced everything, departed, fled, and arriving in all the transports of my early youth, found myself once more at her feet. Alas! I should have died there with joy, had I found in her reception, in her embrace, or in her heart, 1/4 of what I had formerly found there, and which I yet found the undiminished warmth of. Fearful illusions of transitory things! How often dost thou torment us in vain? She received me with that excellence of heart which could only die with her, but I sought the influence there which could never be recalled, and had hardly been half an hour with her before I was once more convinced that my former happiness had vanished forever, and that I was in the same melancholy situation which I had been obliged to fly from, yet without being able to accuse any person with my unhappiness, for Courtille really was not to blame, appearing to see my return with more pleasure than dissatisfaction. But how could I bear to be a secondary person with her to whom I had been everything, and who could never cease being such to me? How could I live an alien in that house where I had been the child? The sight of every object that had been witness to my former happiness rendered the comparison yet more distressing. I should have suffered less in any other habitation, for this incessantly recalled such pleasing remembrances, that it was irritating the recollection of my loss. Consumed with vain regrets, given up to the most gloomy melancholy, I resumed the custom of remaining alone, except at meals. Shut up with my books, I sought to give some useful diversion to my ideas, and feeling the imminent danger of want, which I had so long dreaded, I sought means to prepare for and receive it, when Madame de Warrens should have no other resource. I had placed her household on a footing not to become worse, but since my departure everything had been altered. He who now managed her affairs was a spendthrift, and wished to make a great appearance, such as keeping a good horse with elegant trappings, loved to appear gay in the eyes of the neighbors, and was perpetually undertaking something he did not understand. Her pension was taken up in advance, her rent was in arrears, debts of every kind continued to accumulate. I could plainly foresee that her pension would be seized, and perhaps suppressed. In short, I expected nothing but ruin and misfortune, and the moment appeared to approach so rapidly that I already felt all its horrors. My closet was my only amusement, and after a tedious search for remedies for the sufferings of my mind, I determined to seek some against the evil of distressing circumstances, which I daily expected would fall upon us, and returning to my old chimeras, behold me once more building castles in the air, to relieve this dear friend from the cruel extremities into which I saw her ready to fall. I did not believe myself wise enough to shine in the republic of letters, or to stand any chance of making a fortune by that means. A new idea, therefore, inspired me with that confidence which the mediocrity of my talents could not impart. In ceasing to teach music, I had not abandoned the thoughts of it. On the contrary, I had studied the theory sufficiently to consider myself well informed on the subject. When reflecting on the trouble it had cost me to read music, and the great difficulty I yet experienced in singing at sight, I began to think the fault might as well arise from the manner of noting as from my own dullness, being sensible it was an art which most people find difficult to understand. By examining the formation of the signs, I was convinced they were frequently very ill devised. I had before thought of marking the gamut by figures, to prevent the trouble of having lines to draw, on noting the plainest air, but had been stopped by the difficulty of the octaves, and by the distinction of measure and quantity. This idea returned again to my mind, and on a careful revision of it, I found the difficulties by no means insurmountable. I pursued it successfully, and was at length able to note any music whatever by figures, with the greatest exactitude and simplicity. From this moment I supposed my fortune made, and in the ardor of sharing it with her to whom I owed everything, thought only of going to Paris, not doubting that on presenting my project to the Academy, it would be adopted with rapture. I had brought some money from Lyons. I augmented this stock by the sale of my books, and in the course of a fortnight my resolution was both formed and executed. In short, full of the magnificent ideas it had inspired, and which were common to me on every occasion, I departed from Savoy with my new system of music, as I had formerly done from Turin with my Heron fountain. Such have been the errors and faults of my youth. I have related the history of them with a fidelity which my heart approves. If my riper years were dignified with some virtues, I should have related them with the same frankness. It was my intention to have done this, but I must forego this pleasing task, and stop here. Time, which renders justice to the characters of most men, may withdraw the veil, and should my memory reach posterity, they may one day discover what I had to say. they will then understand why I am now silent. End of Volume 6. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. End of Confessions, Volumes 5 and 6, by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, anonymously translated.